Hello, everybody. This is a program on constitutional government at Harvard. I'm Harvey Mansfield. I'm here with my wife, Anna. And our guest today is Frederick Kagan, hereafter Fred Kagan. He's a resident scholar, senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington. He's a military historian. He graduated from Yale and got his PhD there in Russian and Soviet studies. And he spent 10 years from 1995 to 2005 as a professor teaching at West Point. And he has a number of books. He wrote While America Sleeps in 2000 with his father, Donald Kagan, also a distinguished historian at Yale and dean. And then he wrote Choosing Victory in 2006, promoting the idea of a surge in Iraq, which apparently convinced or appealed to George W. Bush, who ordered the surge. And he's also written books on military history of the Russian army, military history of Tsarist Russia, military history of the Soviet Union, and then a book on Napoleon, The End of the Old Order. And he's been closely involved with study and advising on Ukraine. We're lucky to have him now before he's called away to address some emergency. So the title of his remarks, What's Up with Ukraine? Current Situation and Prospects. Now, Fred Kagan.
Professor Mansfield, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a great honor to receive an invitation from you, and I'm thrilled to have this opportunity to speak to you and your distinguished audience here. I am actually going to try to keep my initial remarks relatively brief. I think a lot of people have questions about the situation in Ukraine, about Russia, about where this might go, and so on. And I would like really to have a conversation that's of most interest to you all instead of just transmitting. So I'll throw out a few observations and then open it to your questions and thoughts. So it is remarkable that we are sitting here closing in on the 250th day of this war, which was supposed to be over in 72 hours, according to the Kremlin and apparently according to the US intelligence community as well, which thought that the Russians were just going to roll straight into Kyiv, take over, do their thing, and then there might be an insurgency. Amazingly, that failed. And there are books to be written, and I hope to be writing one of them with my colleague Mason Clark at the Institute for the Study of War about why it failed. But it has failed. And it's failed as spectacularly as I can recall any military operation launched by a major power at a time and place of its own choosing, unforced. I can't really think of a debacle of this scale that has befallen such a state under such conditions. That's a fascinating study in its own right, as I said, but it left us all with an interesting situation. And the situation is that the Russians have committed to this conflict, and Putin has continued to double down on it, even as Ukrainians have beaten Russian forces back, defeated the Russians around Kyiv, drove them off, defeated them in Kharkiv Oblast and drove them away from that, and are in the process of driving them out of Western Kherson Oblast, driving them off the west bank of the Dnipro River entirely, which will be very important, as well as continuing to make gains in the northeast. The situation in Ukraine now is that the Russians are, in our judgment, incapable of conducting large-scale offensive operations, the influx of Russian mobilized reservists will not change that. At best, the influx will allow the Russians to stabilize their lines probably somewhere further to the rear. I don't think even with the reservists arriving, the Russians will be able to hold their current lines in the face of continued Ukrainian counteroffensives. But they certainly will not allow the Russians to go over to the offensive again. And it's actually very hard to see the conditions under which the Russians can resume meaningful offensive operations in Ukraine. And by that, I mean ground operations that gain new territory. As long as Ukrainian will to fight holds strong, which I don't doubt that it will, and as long as Western willingness to continue to supply Ukraine with the weapons and equipment that it requires holds strong, and I'm actually pretty optimistic about that as well. So that rapidly brings people to the question of whether the war is in stalemate. The answer is no, not at the moment, it isn't. The Ukrainians are continuing to make gains, and conditions are set for the Ukrainians to liberate more of their territory. And it is vitally in America's and NATO's interest for them to continue to do so, for reasons that I'm happy to go into in more detail. Because the terrain that the Ukrainians are focused on liberating is actually strategically vital to the long-term viability of an independent Ukrainian state against what will certainly be future Russian efforts to subvert or attack it. So if we got to a position of stalemate, that would be very problematic for Ukraine, but that is not the current condition. And I anticipate further Ukrainian gains on the ground. The Russians have attempted various things to address their problems. And again, I'm holding out a can of worms, which I'm happy to open if anyone is interested in it. But one of the characteristics of the way the Russians blew this war to begin with is that they blew it in a way that makes it almost impossible for them to recover from the initial errors. So they would basically have to build a new military in order to resume offensive operations. And it's our judgment that they are not able to do that, in fact, for various reasons, and certainly not in the short term. And interestingly, it's not what Putin is trying to do. So Putin, but I say all of that, but it's not clear that Putin understands that. And one of the other things that has characterized this war from the very beginning is that Putin, and I think for a lot of the time, his senior military advisors and military leadership had only a tenuous connection with reality in terms of their own military capabilities and what they could do to increase them or address their own deficiencies. And Putin has continued to shoot behind the target throughout this war in terms of trying to come to grips with the problems in the Russian military, and as a result has generally failed to address the major problems in the Russian military, and frequently has actually compounded them. So he is trying to find ways of fixing the military. He is trying to find ways of resuming the offensive. And he's manifesting in word and deed that he has not changed his objectives at all from the beginning of this war, that he's not looking for any sort of an off-ramp, that the only negotiation he's interested in is negotiating terms of Ukraine's surrender to him. And I think that came out most clearly, most recently in the speech that he just gave to the Valdai Press Club yesterday, in fact. And he's continuing to try to set conditions for a military victory in Ukraine that is not going to be achievable in our judgment. But he's also pursuing other ways of achieving his aims, and he's identified the will of the West, and particularly of Europe, to continue to support Ukraine as the center of gravity that he is most likely to be able to break. I don't think he really thinks that he can break the will of the Ukrainian people to fight at this point. It's possible that he does. You can read the recent attacks on Ukrainian civilian and especially electrical and energy infrastructure. You can read those as attempts to break Ukrainians' will to fight. I'm not sure. But what I'm very confident of is that one of his theories of the case right now is that he can bring enough pain to bear on the West, and he can stir enough fear in the West that he will break the West away from its support for Ukraine. And then when that has happened, he thinks the Ukrainians will have no choice but to surrender to him. And if they don't, they will ultimately run out of resources, and then he will be able to defeat them. That could be true. But as I said up front, I'm skeptical that breaking the West from Ukraine will be as straightforward as Putin thinks that it is. He's pursuing a number of ways of doing that, including, of course, his energy, his attacks on European energy. And I do think that he believes that he will freeze the Europeans into surrender. I think he will fail, but I think that that's his current, one of his current lines of effort and plans. And that's interesting and important because it gives us a timeline. Professor Mansfield was kind enough to mention the work that I did on the surge, and there's a whole shtick that I tend to go through when I try to help people understand why I think President Bush clung to the failing strategy that he was pursuing from 2003 through 2006 for so long. One of the reasons I think that happened is that the theory of the case that the Bush administration was operating on wasn't actually falsifiable until May of 2006, which was the first time when the Iraqis seated a parliament and a government elected based on a constitution that they had adopted themselves. And the Bush administration had the wrong, in my judgment, notion that once there was a legitimate elected Iraqi government, that the insurgency would fade away. I thought that was wrong from very early in the war, but it wasn't a falsifiable proposition until May of 2006. If Putin actually thinks that he can freeze the Europeans into surrender, that proposition isn't really falsifiable until well into the late winter of 2023. And that's important because that should shape the way that we think about his various threats of escalation, various other things, because it does give us a sort of a mark on the wall for what he's probably trying to protract the war until, and hold as much ground as he can until, and possibly even be willing to give some ground, which he seems to have been willing to do in the northeast of Ukraine, in the expectation that he'll be able to get it back once Western support actually collapses. But if he is at all a rigorous thinker, and there's reason to think that he actually is, he won't really be able to regard that test as fully validated or invalidated until into 2023. And I think that that's a significant thing to consider. I'm happy or unhappy to talk about the various Russian nuclear threats, what they are and are not. The short version is I will tell you that I think that the odds of a full-scale global thermonuclear war are as close to zero as they have been since the end of the Cold War. And I don't think that the odds are particularly higher now than they've been for a long time. Could Putin use tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine? Yes. He just denied that he has any interest in doing so, which is interesting, but he could. It's problematic for him in a variety of ways to do that. My judgment is that the odds of that are rising, but still low. Could he cause a radiological incident in Ukraine, either at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that his forces now control, or using a dirty bomb of the sort that he's falsely accusing the Ukrainians of preparing to use? Yes, he could. It's a little hard to make the case for what exactly that does for him, except in some very, very specific circumstances. But it's possible. But on balance, I think that the odds of a nuclear escalation at this time are low, and the odds of a radiological escalation are a little bit higher, but still low. But we shall see. I'm happy to talk about that in more detail if anyone is interested. The one thing that I do want to say clearly, because I do think that there's a little bit of confusion about this, is we have to understand what Putin's framing of this war is and what his objectives are, because he keeps making it clear, and we keep collectively not wanting to hear it. So in the Valdai speech that he just gave, he reiterated his position on Ukrainian sovereignty, which is that Ukraine has no sovereignty. Ukraine has lost its sovereignty, he says. Ukraine is an artificial state, according to Putin, that Russia created. Those are direct quotes. And that only Russia can be the meaningful guarantor of Ukraine's sovereignty, because Russia created Ukraine, and Ukraine is an artificial state. He denies the existence of a Ukrainian ethnicity. Russians and Ukrainians, he says, are one people. And there's a weird sort of excursion that he gets into in the Valdai speech, in which he says, if at some time some portion of people in Ukraine somehow decide that they've reached the level where they should be considered a separate people, then that would have to be treated with respect. Okay. It's a weirdly contorted sentence with a lot of conditionals and a lot of vagueness, but the only thing that's clear is he rejects the notion that Ukrainians have reached such a state now. And so he rejects the idea that there is a Ukrainian ethnicity, a Ukrainian ethnos, and he rejects the right of the Ukrainian state to be recognized as an independent and sovereign state. There's no off-ramp in there. That's not the language that one uses when one is serious about having any kind of negotiation. And it's not the language that one uses if one is actually scaling back one's objectives to be something short of regime change. Now, we can talk about Putin's rhetoric, and I am not naive about the ability of dictators, and even not dictators, to use inflammatory rhetoric in various different ways while intending to make compromises in the background and so forth. But I'm prepared to get into a discussion with anyone who's interested about why I am actually confident that this rhetoric is real, reflects his real thoughts, and is indicative of the fact that he is continuing to pursue absolutist aims in this war and is not interested in compromises or off-ramps. The discussions about Russians and Ukrainians being one people and the denial of Ukrainian ethnicity, coupled with Russification efforts that the Russians have engaged in the occupied areas of Ukraine really have to make us ask questions about the degree to which this is a genocidal undertaking. And I think it's obviously a very fraught question, and I'm among those who is uncomfortable with the way that the word genocide has been denatured over the years and applied in circumstances where I think it might be questionable. But when you have the leader of an invading power explicitly denying the existence of the ethnicity of the state that he's invaded, when you have mass population displacements of Ukrainians into Russia, of Russians into Ukraine, and particularly when you have a deliberate effort to seize Ukrainian children from occupied areas and have them adopted into Russian families, something that the Russians brag about. I think the question imposes itself, and I think it's something that we need to think seriously about. So that makes the stakes in this war, I think, which were already high, even higher. I'm happy to talk about the stakes. And I want to make it clear, and I guess I'll close with this and see what people would like to interrogate and engage on. But this is one of those cases where I am equally comfortable arguing for the same US policy and the same Western policy on a so-called realist or a so-called idealist basis. I think you can make exactly the same case with equal force, referring only to naked national interest as if values were not part of national interest, and making the case based on values. And I, for one, actually don't think you can make sensible arguments about national interest that imagines that values are not part of that. But setting that question aside, I think that you can do it either way. And I think the argument in either case leads to the conclusion that it is imperative for the United States and Western allies to continue to support Ukraine in the liberation of at least all of its territory up to the pre-February 2022 line, and possibly beyond that, that it's in our interest as an alliance, as a security matter, it's in our interest as a nation as a security matter, and it's in our interest as a people as a matter of values and decency and concern about the kind of world that we hope and expect to live in. So I will stop there and be happy to address questions.
Thanks very much, Fred. That's good. Now, if people will raise their hands.
We already have a question. Tom Palmer, please.
Good afternoon. Tom Friedman is somebody I've read with more respect recently than ever before. He's writing more realistically about, I think, Ukraine and its relation to climate change and all that. Says that this is now Putin's now declaring an energy war. He's given up on the other one. It's all about freezing Europe and breaking them off from the Western coalition. Just wondered if you'd address that further, even further than you did in your previous remarks, please.
Well, that he's pursuing an energy war as opposed to a military conflict, or in addition?
Yeah. I think he suggested and recently that he's given up on the military part, and he thinks he can not lose the war by essentially defeating Europe and its commitment to Ukraine based on freezing them out, and the pipeline that he probably blew up and all the other measures to.
He certainly he certainly does intend to freeze them out and break the support for Ukraine. And by freezing the Europeans. There's no question about that. But he has not given up on winning the war militarily. And this has been one of the more remarkable things to observe. So he just mobilized ostensibly 300,000 Russian, ostensibly reservists. I throw a lot of ostensiblies in here because there's been a lot of fiction about what the Russians, I mean, it's actually, for those of us who have been following Russia for a long time, there's nothing new about this, but there's been a lot of fictional discussion in Russia about what's going on, and then a lot of actuality of what's going on. But ostensibly, he's been doing a partial call-up of reservists and has found 300,000 of those folks and is sending them in to fight in Ukraine. That's not what you do if you're giving up on a war. That's not what you do if you're giving up militarily. He's paying a very high price domestically for doing that. There's even indications that he's paying a high price in regime inner circles, where tensions within his inner circle have become manifest in a way that we haven't seen for decades. All in service of getting warm bodies, which is pretty much the bar that seems to be required to be mobilized as a reservist, into the fight in Ukraine. Now, you could say that he's doing that just to try to hold the lines in hopes of freezing the Europeans out, and that's possible. But he is setting conditions for, at a minimum, the eventuality that it doesn't work and that he'll have to fight on a larger scale next year. So we will have the beginning of Russian annual conscription in 3 days, 4 days, which will be part of a Russian attempt to rebuild. Now, this is the normal conscription cycle, but they will use this to try to rebuild military capability in the longer term. He's finally starting to crank up his military industry. He's taken shockingly long, actually, to try to mobilize his military industry. He's now doing that. He's created a military structure, or a civil military structure that, for those who are familiar with the Soviet World War II practice, is similar to the Stavka, to coordinate all of the civilian, military, industrial activities related to the war. Again, it's shocking that he's taken this long to do it, but he's just done this. These are not, none of these to me are indications that he's giving up on military victory in this war. I think he's pursuing both options, which I think he sees as being reinforcing.
Thank you. We have 3 questions lined up. First, Cliff, and then Harrison Flynn, and then Ostap Stepak. Cliff, you can unmute yourself.
Actually, this is Donna Orwins hiding in the background. Hi, Fred. It's wonderful to see you. And I'll be sure that Ethan will listen to this. Since he's in Tunis, he can't, the time doesn't work, but he has tremendous respect for you. Did I hear you say at the end of your talk that you'd be okay if things went back to February 24th? Because I thought you said, as you would, well, anyway, that surprised me.
Well, I'm okay. I'm not okay with it. I personally think that first of all, there's no circumstance under which I think we can recognize the Russian seizure of Crimea or the territory that they had taken in the Donbass in 2014. There's no circumstance in which I think we can recognize that. Which is a problem because the Russians will make that a precondition for any peace deal. So from that standpoint, no way we recognize it. I made an argument, I lost all track of time, but I think it was a couple of weeks ago, that it's actually even more in NATO's interest than in Ukraine's for Ukraine to regain the Crimean Peninsula. Because as a military strategic matter, Crimea is a magnificent Russian base for threatening the southeastern NATO flank. And it would be very much more advantageous to NATO for Ukraine to have that than for the Russians. And of course, it's Ukrainian territory, and I support the Ukrainians retaking it. I'm careful in how I say this, simply because the Russians have created sufficient information space gradient about Crimea, especially, all based on fiction. I mean, it's all based on the fiction that somehow Crimea is less rightfully Ukrainian than any other part of Ukraine, which is an amusing fiction given that Putin just reiterated he doesn't think any of Ukraine is rightfully Ukrainian. So why we should continue even to play along with his bad joke that it matters when Crimea was handed over, because he doesn't think it matters when Ukraine was handed over. But he's created such a gradient in the information space that I'm careful how I state the objectives that I think we have to push for. I would say to you that from my own perspective, I think that it is right and necessary to support Ukraine in regaining control of all of its territory, including Crimea and the 2014 occupied areas. I think that there is more room for reasonable people to disagree about that as a practical realpolitik matter, not as a principled matter. There's no room for disagreement as a principled matter, but as a practical realpolitik matter, I think there's relatively more room to disagree about that than about anything else. But I myself am not conflicted about it.
That includes Donetsk and Luhansk?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Say hi to Ethan for me.
I will, for sure.
Harrison Flynn, please.
Thank you very much for your time, sir. I really appreciate it. And I don't want to waste it with retrospectives or hypotheticals. So if you think this isn't important, please don't waste your time answering. But my own thought is that there were very knowledgeable, smart, experienced people inside Ukraine who had made very clear before February that if Putin tried to invade, it was going to be his funeral. And I wonder how they got it right and our intelligence community got it so wrong. And the reason I think this is important is not just to assign blame, but how, for example, does this affect our present views toward China and Taiwan and so forth? I'd love to hear your views on that, and thank you.
Thank you. I love this question. I'll start this way. So I am the team at the Institute for the Study of War that's been tracking this for many years, and which I oversee, got one big thing wrong in our forecasting. We didn't think Putin would invade. And we forecasted that he would not launch this invasion. So take everything that I say with the understanding that I got the really big thing wrong to start with. And we've been completely transparent and candid about that. But we got another big thing right, which is we said, if he invades, it'll be a mess. And I was shocked at what I was hearing coming out of the US military intelligence community at the time about their assessments. Why did they get it wrong? In summary, there were two basic factors, I think, that led them to get it wrong. One is they seem really to have underestimated the willingness of Ukrainians to fight. Candidly, I find that baffling. And it made me say then and ever since, have you ever spoken with a Ukrainian? Because I engage with quite a number of Ukrainians, by the way, including Ukrainians who are Russian-speaking Ukrainians from the East. And
exactly.
I had no doubt in my mind that they would fight like lions, which they did. So I was always baffled by that, and I have no explanation to offer about why the intelligence community got that wrong to the extent that they did. And that's apposite for Taiwan also. I'll come to that in a minute, because this is a very important question you're asking. But they were also wrong about the Russian performance. And here I think I can offer a little bit of insight that is relevant and is also relevant to the China case. Look, forecasting the performance of a military in a war based on peacetime preparation is an incredibly fraught activity. It's just unbelievably hard to do, because you can look brilliant in exercises and look like a fool actually fighting an enemy, which is exactly what the Russians did. And that's not uncommon. So how does the Defense Intelligence Agency, how do professionals actually go about doing net assessment and doing these kinds of forecasts? Well, they tend to use stochastic modeling of units that are assigned strength values based on personnel fill and equipment type and various other measurable things, and assume that a brigade is a brigade and a battalion is a battalion. If you take a certain kind of mechanized brigade and put it against another kind of mechanized brigade, then it'll have this kind of range of outcomes based on how the dice roll in your stochastic modeling. That's fundamentally how most of these simulations are done. I'm simplifying, but not too badly, I'm afraid. When you then ask questions about, okay, but I get the systems, we can count the tanks, we have models about what happens when a T-72 shoots a tank main gun round at another T-72, I got all that. But how well are the Russians structured to command and control a large-scale mechanized invasion? Well, the models don't really account for that, because in most of the models, as I understand them, as they seem to have played out, if you assume a brigade is a brigade, then you assume that a brigade ordered to go to the attack will conduct an attack in a reasonably intelligent fashion. That isn't what happened. And one of the reasons why we were wrong that Putin would invade was because we were looking hard at the way that he had mobilized his forces and the kinds of force groupings that he had created along the various invasion axes from Belarus and then from westernmost Russia and then all the way around. And we observed that there were weirdnesses in the force composition and structure and a command and control, lack thereof, of those units. The fact that they were throwing together elements of battalions from lots of different brigades and regiments from all across Russia. They didn't then exercise together. So these were guys who know each other. They never fought together. They never trained together. They didn't exercise while they were there. They weren't working in normal command and control arrangements, which means that they didn't know who their commanders didn't know them. All kinds of soft things that you can't easily put into stochastic models, or at least that we don't tend to put into stochastic models, that we looked at and said, this is going to be a mess. But apparently our intelligence community didn't really look at very hard or weight those things. And then there were just things that it actually is hard to know from the outside. And those are things like, there's a meme that I really enjoyed. This war has produced a lot of great memes. And one of the memes that I really enjoyed is there's a picture of Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu looking very pure, which is his normal look these days. And the caption is, when you've been stealing half of the Russian defense budget and you discovered that the chief of the general staff has been stealing the other half. The kleptocracy in Putin's Russia was more even than the most pessimistic of us thought that it might be. And it turns out that the Russian military was a hollow shell. I don't know what our intelligence community could have known about that, but they don't seem to have known about it, actually. And that means that we just missed a whole bunch of things about how messed up the Russian military actually was in all of its fundamentals. So those are the major factors. Now, what does that have to do with Taiwan? This is a very important question because we're now hearing an increasing number of people who are saying we need to draw lessons from Ukraine to apply to the defense of Taiwan. And I was having a conversation with a China expert about this the other day, and I think he's actually working on something that is explicitly doing that, sort of chapter by chapter. And I said, you realize that almost every chapter is going to have to begin Taiwan, unlike Ukraine, because it's actually hard to imagine two circumstances more different from one another than the situation that Taiwan is in and the situation that Ukraine is in. It's also hard, I think, to imagine states more different from each other than Russia and China. We've known that Russia is a kleptocracy. We've known that it is a personalized dictatorship where the organs of power don't function normally, and so on and so on. She might create something like that, but for now, I think the China experts that I talk to tell me that's not the way China is. China is a functioning state, it's a functioning party, it's a functioning bureaucracy. It has the various pathologies of communist dictatorships, and then, of course, pathologies with the Chinese. I've forgotten the Chinese phrase here, but with Chinese characteristics. But it's a normal functioning communist dictatorship in that sense. And it's also a literal order of magnitude wealthier than Russia. And we do need to keep that in mind, that going into this war, the GDP of Russia was similar to the GDP of Australia. And China is just a vastly wealthier country with a much more robust structure. We should not assume that the Chinese military is going to be as messed up as the Russian military from the standpoint of resources and theft and all that kind of stuff. However, there are two similarities, and I'll leave this here unless anyone else wants to pick this up, that are relevant. The Russians blew this in part because they have not fought a large-scale mechanized war against a meaningful enemy since 1945. So there was no one in the Russian military at all who had any notion of what it actually was like to fight a large-scale mechanized invasion. The Chinese have not fought a large-scale war of any variety since 1979 against Vietnam. So we're dealing with a Chinese military that is built entirely by people who have never actually fought a large-scale war. The question of their ability to build and then wield a military in an incredibly complicated invasion scenario is something that begs a lot of investigation. And we should not take for granted that they will straightforwardly be able to do that. And then the other relevant parallel is the question of, will the Taiwanese fight? Now, there's a lot. Thank you, Eric. There's a lot of factors that go into whether the Taiwanese will fight or not. And I think people have opinions that are far too strong about that, frankly. Because those who say that the Taiwanese won't fight point to polling that say that 30-something% of Taiwanese are not interested in fighting and all that kind of stuff. Maybe. What I want to say is nobody knows how people are going to react when bombs actually start exploding and enemy landing craft start turning up on beaches. We have a lot of opinions about this, but nobody actually knows what will happen when that happens. By the way, the default set of humans in that situation is to fight, which is what the Ukrainians did. That's the normal reaction to invasion, is that people fight. Now, the Chinese are trying to make it so that something different will happen, and there's all kinds of issues, and I accept the complexity, but anyway, let me leave it at that. Thank you. Thank you for the question.
Thank you very much.
Ostap Stefak, we have an Ukrainian student here, so you may ask.
A Harvard student from Ukraine.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Professor Mansfield. Professor Kagan, thank you for your time to speak about this. It's especially interesting for me to hear your thoughts. I also follow the daily updates from the Institute for the Study of War. So great to hear from you. I want to ask you quite a broad question about the structure of US policy in Ukraine and how it's framed. So I was at a talk with Alex Lindman recently, and he used the term strategic ambiguity quite a lot to describe US policy until recently in Taiwan and also in Ukraine, even at the moment. So what do you think has been the effect of this kind of policy on the pace of escalation from Russia's side? And also, do you think there's any kind of pre-commitment to sudden actions that the US and more generally the West could use to somehow improve the situation?
Well, first, let me say, Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava.
I think it's problematic to apply the phrase strategic ambiguity from Taiwan to Ukraine. Strategic ambiguity has a very specific meaning with regard to Taiwan that is absent in the case of Ukraine, and it's important to draw this distinction. The issue of strategic ambiguity about Taiwan is in the weird degree to which Taiwan's independence exists in a sort of a quantum state like Schrodinger's cat in US policy. And do we regard Taiwan as independent or not? Well, formally, no, but sort of yes, and we're determined to leave it that way. Will we fight for Taiwan's independence? Well, see point A. But then, yes, if you listen to President Biden, what's US formal policy? That's been the strategic ambiguity. But the strategic ambiguity with regard to Taiwan goes all the way to the issue of Taiwan's independence and sovereignty. We've never been ambiguous about Ukraine's sovereignty. We never have been. The United States recognized Ukraine as a sovereign state when it became independent. We've never wavered in that. We've never questioned it. We've always taken the position that Ukraine is a sovereign state. We've never recognized the Russian illegal annexations of Crimea or occupation of the Donbass. We've never been ambiguous about any of that stuff at all. And that puts Ukraine in a different category from Taiwan from the standpoint of ambiguity. We were not ambiguous either about whether we would fight if Ukraine was invaded. President Biden was quite clear. As soon as we started warning that the Russians would invade Ukraine, President Biden started saying, we will not fight to defend Ukraine. So there was no ambiguity there either. I'm happy to talk about whether that was the right thing to say or the wrong thing to say, but it wasn't ambiguous, whatever it was. Neither is our policy today ambiguous. Our current stated policy, reiterated constantly by everyone in the administration, is that Ukraine has a right to recover all of its territory, and that the United States is interested in supporting it to fulfill that right and recover all of its territory, including Crimea and Donbass. That's the formal position of the US government, and it's not ambiguous. So in that sense, that's why I think it's really not appropriate to use the term strategic ambiguity to talk about Ukraine. The issue in Ukraine is different. The issue in Ukraine is that the Biden administration is very concerned about Russian, quote, escalation, and I throw that quote in there because we need to talk about what we think that actually means, and is very intently engaged in a certain sense, a negotiation with itself about what it thinks might trigger whatever it thinks Russian escalation would be. And it's that internal negotiation that has constrained the kinds of weapon systems that the US has been willing to give Ukraine. But that's not strategic ambiguity. That's a matter of escalation management. And I have a lot of quarrel with the way that the Biden administration has gone about doing this. And I think that in general terms, it's, the US has been a day late and a weapon system short throughout this conflict in terms of what we should have been providing. But having made that criticism, I also have to observe, more importantly, that the Biden administration has been steadfast in never walking away from core principles about Ukraine's right to recover all of its territory, about US support for that right, about refusing to engage in negotiations about Ukraine without Ukraine, and a number of other very central principles. And of course, as much as I might criticize the Biden administration for what it hasn't given Ukraine, the things it has given Ukraine have been absolutely essential for Ukraine to fight off the Russian invasion in the first place and to regain the territory that Ukraine has regained. Now, we need to be very clear about this. This is Ukrainians fighting for Ukraine. There are no Americans fighting, there are no American soldiers fighting in Ukraine. And we have not made this our war, and it isn't our war. It's Ukrainian heroism and skill that has defended Ukraine and that has liberated large parts of Ukraine. But Ukrainians would not have been able to do that without the weapons and equipment and supplies that America and our partners have provided to them. And the Biden administration deserves a lot of credit for that. So I don't think that strategic ambiguity is the right thing to talk about. I think escalation management is the framework for this discussion. I'm not happy with the way the Biden administration has gone about dealing with that, but I think it's on balance. Look, Ukraine would have fallen by now, but for the aid of all types that the Biden administration has provided. And of course, but for the heroism of the Ukrainian people, which is why I also say Heroyam Slava.
Thank you. We have Susan Hamilton, David Epstein, and then Joe Crystal, if he's still around.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about cybersecurity or cyber warfare in this conflict. In particular, I've been wondering if Russia's attempts to freeze Europe out don't have the desired effect. Will they then escalate to, more traditional cyber attacks on? They're attacking Ukraine, but outside Ukraine and on Ukrainian allies in the West. But any thoughts you have on cyber warfare would be interesting.
I fear they will be less interesting than you might desire, because the problem with cyber is all the most interesting and important stuff is either classified or proprietary. And we often in war games now, when we do war games and we try to play cyber, we've started to quip that, I'd like to buy 5 quarts of cyber, because there's almost sort of nothing meaningful that you can really say in an unclassified setting about it. So with that caveat, I can offer you the following general observations. The Russians seem to be less good at this than everybody thought they were. Or alternatively, we collectively are a lot better at defending against it than people thought we would be. The Russians have unquestionably unleashed their cyber arsenal on Ukraine and generally failed to defeat the combination of whatever state support Western states have been giving Ukraine, which I assume we have been, but I have no idea. But the simple support of the American majors. It turns out that Microsoft is not an adversary that is easy to take on. even as Russia. And neither are Google and neither are Amazon. Their abilities to shield against the most common massive cyber attacks and disruptions are really quite formidable. And I think we've seen enough indication that the Russians have tried and failed, tried and been turned back, to say our terrors about cyber may, at least as regards the Russians, may be somewhat overstated. Now, that having been said, there is also an important deterrence factor here. And I think there is reason to believe from things that have been said in the media that the US has seized occasions to let the Russians know in action what might happen to them if they really mixed it up with us, possibly in such a way to cause them to think that maybe that's not the best course of action for them. And this is the place where you get rapidly into three ports of cyber kinds of discussions, because US offensive cyber capabilities are the last thing in the world that anyone will ever talk to you about in any meaningful way. What I can say with confidence, and I don't have any clearances, so I don't have any inside information. I don't know if I'm talking to people. But I'm very confident that our offensive cyber capabilities are very formidable, and formidable enough that the Russians are concerned about them. So it's possible that they will come after us in this way. They are threatening to come after us in this way. They're threatening to come after us in other ways. They may. But there are deterrence calculations here. There are escalation dynamics and deterrence calculations here that will come into play. The US is unquestionably highly vulnerable to cyber attacks in many, many ways. And what I said about, the major's ability to defend Ukraine had a lot to do with Ukraine. And the fact that I think Ukraine in general had a more limited attack surface than we do, and a bunch of other things, and of course had been under Russian cyber attack consistently for a long time and had been hardening against that in its own ways, in ways that we have not been. So I am very concerned about the general vulnerabilities of America to cyber attack. I don't think we're doing anything remotely like what we need to do to defend ourselves, to prepare to defend ourselves. A whole bunch of factors go in here, including fundamental mistrust of the American government, sowed by Snowden and others, which are hugely problematic. So I'm concerned about all of that. But I think I'm less sanguine about our ability to defend ourselves against cyber attack. But I do think that our ability to deter the Russians from going there is probably the more significant factor that would restrain this.
Thank you.
David Epstein, please, then Joe Crystal, then Eric Edelman.
Thank you very much for this conversation and also for your previous work. I wondered if you could say more about your discussion of Russia's gearing up for a new offensive next year. Is that likely to be feasible? Will it be constrained by what they've already lost? And will it be constrained by economic sanctions and technology controls?
I don't know, yes and yes. I don't know if it will be feasible or not. It definitely will be badly constrained by what they have lost and what they will lose. And it is also being seriously constrained by import controls in very important ways. So I'll do the second and third first, and then I'll come to the what do I think they'll be able to do. Again, I'm trying to stay out of some real tactical weeds here, but there are the way that they mobilized their forces for the initial invasion and then for the subsequent reinforcements of that effort broke up all of the units in the Russian ground forces, all services in Russia that have ground forces, in such a way that there are no uncommitted units. There is no reserve in Russia of actual formed combat units that the Russians can deploy. That's very important. They've committed everything that they have. They haven't committed everybody in the ground forces, but they've committed everything that was formed into a unit, and they've broken up units to do that. So their alternatives when it comes to building new combat power are either trying to field entirely new units or sending reserves, replacements, new conscripts to replace individual losses in existing units. They've been doing the latter. They've been sending individuals as individual replacements to units that are already in the field on the whole, which is pretty much the only thing that they can do. Because if you want to build new units, if you want to build a new battalion, for example, then you need to have not just 400 or 500 or 600 Ivans to throw in the battalion with AK-47s and, ideally a bunch of armored vehicles. You also need to have a battalion commander. Well, the battalion commander, should be a lieutenant colonel. In a wartime, maybe you can decide that he's a senior major. But he's an officer that has been in the military for quite some time and has gained the experience going up the ranks about how to command an organization like that. Well, they don't have that. They don't have it because they have committed all of those guys to the fight and taken devastating losses among their tactical officers, even among senior officers, but especially among their tactical officers, brigade, regiment, battalion, company. Their officer corps has been decimated. It's very hard to build new combat units if you don't have an officer corps that you can draw on. We did it in the Second World War. You can, but they tend not to perform very well for quite some time. So how could that work? Well, it can work if you're willing to pull some of your guys off of the battlefield, including some of your junior officers who've gotten some good experience and survived to tell about it, and bring them back, give them time measured in many months or years, and build new units around them, and then prepare to send those units in. Then over a period of time, honestly, if you try to do this faster than about a year, you're really not going to have a very good unit, but you can do it if you push hard in about a year. At the end of a year, then you start to have new units that you can throw in. The thing is, that's not what Putin is doing. He's not pulling anything back. He's not letting anything form in the rear. As soon as they generate reservists, they throw them right into the front line. And in fact, one of the big scandals that's created a lot of strain in Russian society and even in the Russian inner circle has been the fact that they are grabbing people off the street who are nominally in the reserve and sending them into Ukraine to fight, sometimes in a matter of literal days with no training whatsoever, sometimes after a couple of weeks retraining. So they're burning through their reserves as fast as they put their hands on them, which will make it impossible for them to be generating new combat units over the next 12 months. Because they're literally eating all of their seed corn. But they're eating their seed corn even more literally than that, because our team has tracked that they have deployed people from their training centers to fight. They've deployed their trainers into combat, and the trainers have gotten killed. Okay, well, now we're seeing this play out, and we're getting reports, reliable reports from Russia that they don't have enough trainers. This is one of the reasons, by the way, why you've got a lot of Russians in Belarus right now. It is not our assessment that the Russians are going to be invading from Belarus again, still less that you're ever going to see Belarusians invade from Belarus, because Lukashenko is not that stupid. But there are training grounds in Belarus, and there are Belarusian trainers in Belarus, and the Russians need that. Because back home in Mother Russia, we are hearing reports that they are having recruits training other recruits, basically. They're having reservists train other reservists because they have shot through their own trainers as well. All of that bodes very ill for Putin from the standpoint of actually being able to generate effective offensive capability in 2023. In terms of the import-export restrictions, those have been critical. This is why they are turning to Iranian drones and missiles. The Russians have, well, so to begin with, going back to the meme I told you about Shoigu, I do believe that there have been more than a few instances in this war when frontline commanders have called back to arsenals and said, Yuri, send me 500 more precision-guided munitions, and heard on the other end of the line, sir, it's like this, with an hollow echo in the background because there were no weapons. But those weapons that they did manage to lay their hands on, they've largely used. And Ukrainians have offered some statistics, which I can't verify, but seem to track generally what we're hearing, that they've used almost their entire arsenal of many categories of precision weapons. They can't build anymore because those weapons rely on microchips and other equipment that they can't produce domestically, and they now can't purchase on the global market. And interestingly to me, the Chinese appear to be very uninterested in providing them with these chips. I suspect because the Chinese are not interested in having us sanction them if they did so. So Russians can't make these things, so they're turning to Iranian equipment, which they're using in the heinous and hateful way, for which, of course, it was designed, because the Iranians fully intended to use it in a heinous and hateful way. But it also turns out not to be terrifically high quality, and the Ukrainians have been shooting down Iranian drones at a very high rate because they are very vulnerable. So those factors are going to make it very difficult for Putin to reconstitute an effective offensive force next year. But difficult is not impossible, and he could change course. And this is one of the things that we keep watching for. If he became actually serious about building a meaningful offensive capability to use after the spring thaw, so sometime in the next summer, he would start to hold back reservists, he would start to pull back some experienced units, and he would start to set conditions to train up new units to fight next year. We've seen all of the indications running in the opposite direction so far, which leads me to forecast for now that he will not be generating effective offensive combat power for next year, but we're constantly looking for changes in this because that would be a significant inflection.
Thank you. Joe Crystal, please.
Thanks. Fred, it's nice to chat with you about Ukraine yet again. I always learn something new. I was going to just following up on sort of the last point you made about combat power for the Russians. How concerned are you, whether for political or logistical reasons, how concerned are you about our ability to appropriately, equip the Ukrainians in the months ahead with the right weapons they need to both defend their territory, but also to continue some sort of counteroffensive?
I'm concerned, Joe, as I'm sure you are also, and lots of people who are watching this, because we also haven't mobilized our defense industry for this, and that's really not acceptable. You know, we used to be the arsenal of democracy. We're functioning as an arsenal of democracy in a limited way. But I think there has been a belief that this would be a short war. I think it's taken us too long to get ourselves out of the idea that this will be a short war. If we have gotten ourselves out of that idea, I'm not persuaded that we have. And I think that this is where you start to run into problems with the Biden administration's priorities. This is not an administration that's interested in spending a lot on the military. It's made that clear. That's not where its priorities lie. And it just hasn't gotten us ready to support this effort over the long term. And I think that we really need to do that urgently. Could we? Sure. These are problems that money could solve fundamentally. But the money has to be allocated, and then the money has to be spent, and that has to happen promptly. And we're not set up to do this kind of thing well. And by the way, if we're asking questions about lessons for Taiwan, the fact that we get this quickly to strains on our arsenals in a war that we're not fighting should be highly alarming to us, and should lead us to reconsider big aspects of our defense industrial base. Now, by the way, there are other points to make about problems in our defense industrial base. We don't build weapons that are very good for giving partners like Ukraine to fight with. Some of them are great. HIMARS are super. But M1s are not. And our fighter aircraft are not, on the whole, with some exceptions, really super platforms to be ready to give to states that are not already trained to NATO standards. The Soviets are great at this. There's a reason why almost everybody in the world uses AK-47s and Soviet crap tanks and planes. And the reason is because they're super easy to learn how to use. They're super easy to maintain. They don't perform super well, but when they break, you can usually take a hammer and fix them. None of those things are true of American kit. Nor should they be. We have an unbelievably professional military that you were a part of, and you know perfectly well, better than I, the excellence of our soldiers and sailors, airmen and Marines, and their ability to use unbelievably sophisticated stuff to its full. We need to have all of that. But we might also think about beginning to design weapons and weapon systems that would be suitable for provision to allies that are not at that standard. This is a completely alien thought. We don't do this. But we need to consider the fact that if we don't do this, the alternatives everybody has are whatever is left over from this war of Russian kit or Chinese kit. And I'm not very excited about having people turn to those alternatives. So I'm alarmed about every aspect of this war from the standpoint of our defense industrial base. And I'm particularly alarmed that we really don't seem to be drawing the right lessons or taking the right actions in response.
Eric Edelman, please.
Amen, Fred, to what you just said. First, thank you for what you, Kim, and your colleagues at ISW, but also at the Critical Threats Project are doing on both Ukraine and the spreading insurgent activity in Iran as well. I have one comment and then a couple of quick questions for you. The one comment is on your in your opening remarks, you talked about the genocidal nature of this, and you adduced a lot of very good evidence for it. The one thing you didn't mention is the persistent, almost constant drumbeat of eliminationist genocidal rhetoric every night on Russian television from regime propagandists like Skabayeva and Simonyan and Solovyov, and it's really hair curling, and and it I think plays precisely to the point you made. Three quick questions. One, Reuters did a very interesting analysis of thousands of documents from Balaklia that were left behind by the Russians as they evacuated out of Kharkiv. And among other things, they seem to suggest that most of those units and the other units in Lugansk and Donetsk are operating at about 20% manning levels. We would consider those combat ineffective units, in our system. So my question is, this is a little bit draws on your question and answer with David. Far from generating more combat power, it seems to me there's a very real possibility of just a Russian military collapse. And I wonder if you could talk just briefly about the potential for that to happen. I mean, historically, we know it happened in 1917. The Russian army just walked away from the front. Second, on the point you made about the Russians getting down to the bottom of their magazine of precision guided munitions. I mean, they fired over 5,000 missiles. They're using S-300 air defense missiles for offensive operations, which obviously indicates that they're pretty down at the bottom of the barrel. I mean, they've been using Bastion coastal defense missiles in a land attack mode, et cetera. But I am worried about the Shahed 136s and the impact that they're having. And the Ukrainians are saying they're shooting down about 70% of them. I suspect that's an exaggeration, but even if they're shooting 70% of them down, they're having a disproportionate effect on the electrical, water, and other infrastructure in Ukraine. Am I crazy, or would CRAM be a very good solution for this, since these are slow flying? We know what CRAM was able to do for us in Iraq, and Joe may have a comment on that as well. But it seems to me that we ought to be doing more to immediately augment their air defense. This shouldn't be an insoluble problem. These are slow-moving, aircraft that should be able to be defended against. And then finally, the one thing you said that I'm not sure I agree with, as someone who's been a close observer of Vladimir Putin for 23 years, I am not persuaded he is a rigorous thinker. And I wonder if you could just share with us what the evidence is that you believe demonstrates that.
Well, okay. Let me immediately disappoint you on the second question, because I'm not a weaponeer and I stay within my area of expertise. I don't know. I mean, the Ukrainians are shooting these things down with everything from shotguns to rifles to air defense systems. I don't know whether CRAM would make sense or not. But I'll just foot stomp what you said, which is we all collectively need a solution to the drone problem. And of course, the Israelis are not interested in providing the Ukrainians with the solution that they have. So other solutions need to be found, and need to be found urgently. I actually am inclined to believe the Ukrainian numbers about how many they're shooting down, because I think I've heard that our forces had similar rates of success in Syria against these drones. These drones are just not that hard to shoot down. But your point about the disproportionate effects that they're having, of course, is key. And the Ukrainians need a solution to this problem, and we all need a solution to this problem. So here, but I don't know what it would be. Putin is a rigorous thinker. Look, I'll put it to you this way: I create the non-rigorous distinction myself between rationality and logic, where to me logic is just the ability to follow a logical train of thought from start to finish, and rationality really has to do with the degree to which the predicates are in accord with reality. I find Putin generally to be relatively logical, but not always rational, and increasingly not rational in this sense. That there have been relatively few times that I've been observing the statements and decisions that he's been making where the logical train doesn't flow, but many occasions where the basis in reality of the predicates is not there. And so That's what I mean when I refer to him as a rigorous thinker. Rigorous is too strong. I would say able to follow a logical train. But also I would say in contrast to an emotional thinker or actor, he does tend to think things out, and I think emotional spasmodic decisions are less natural to him than to some other kinds of leaders. The first question, remind me what the first question was, I'm sorry.
Potential collapse of the Russian army.
Yes. Okay, so look, we've been observing the same thing, and we were thrilled by that trove because it confirmed the assessments that we've been making for some time, which is the Russians actually had many, if not most of their units at fill levels that we would regard as combat ineffective, basically having ceased to exist as a unit. And we saw that in part because, the basic Russian maneuver unit is what they call a battalion tactical group. We started to see the Ukrainians discussing Russian operations in Kherson of platoon tactical groups, which we read to mean that the battalion probably been whittled down to about a platoon strength. Look, the collapse of the Russian military is a serious possibility. There is a question of 1917, which I think is unlikely. But what the team is observing now is that we're seeing indications and statements that the Russians are actually planning to push newly mobilized reservists to the perimeter in Kherson and withdraw the remnants of the elite airborne units that have been holding the line there back, with the reservists as the detachment left in contact to cover that withdrawal. Okay, I mean, no.
They'll just get slaughtered.
Yeah, I mean, they will not bother to get slaughtered because they will run and surrender. Now, so the question then becomes, if that covering force doesn't cover, what happens to those airborne guys while they're trying to withdraw? They could break. And that kind of thing, as you know, can be infectious. And in fact, we saw exactly that in the Kharkiv counteroffensive, where an entire sector collapsed and the infection did spread. I mean, this is, you're a super military historian in your own right, and you know perfectly well when people panic and start running to the rear, they tend to take people with them rather than being stabilized by them in a force whose morale is bad. And the Ukrainians, as I'm sure you saw reported, captured an entire regiment's worth of kit from the Taman motorized rifle division of the 1st Guards Tank Army, which was, in principle, one of the most elite forces that was earmarked for the defense against the NATO invasion or the invasion of NATO. And those guys ran for the hills and left their kit behind them. The Ukrainians picked up some really nice gear, really high-end T-80, such and such T-90 tanks that those guys left behind. So it is very possible that that could happen. And frankly, Eric, that's the scenario in which it seems to be most likely that the Ukrainians retake Crimea. If the Russians are able to retreat in good order and defend the Perekop Isthmus, I think retaking Crimea is going to be very, very hard militarily. But if the Ukrainians get across the Dnipro in such a way that the Russian forces down there actually collapse, well, that's how the Russians got across the isthmus themselves. And that could be the way that that could occur. So I think it's very possible. It all depends, I think, on what kind of offensive the Ukrainians are able to generate and what kind of shock effect they're able to generate against Russians in what kind of morale condition that they're in. But yeah, it's a distinct possibility.
Thank you. I don't know if Joe wants to chime in on CRAM, but So you get the chance. And I have a question too, because you were speaking about the internal negotiations within the administration that restrain armament. Can you give some lay people insight as to what is being played out and how it constrains armament, and what your disagreements are with that?
Well, I was being a little bit flip because and even if I knew exactly what the discussions were in the administration, I wouldn't talk about them in public, but I don't. But what I mean is that, judging from the administration rhetoric, there is, and a lot of people talking about it, there is a group in the administration that is very powerful, that is very worried that if we give the Ukrainians certain kinds of weapon systems, that would cause the Russians to escalate in some unspecified way. And that the fear of causing the Russians to escalate in some unspecified way has caused us to hold back various weapon systems for a long. We didn't want to give the Ukrainians HIMARS for a long time because we thought some people thought that would be escalatory. We still don't want to give the Ukrainians, F-16s because people think that would be escalatory. For a long time, we didn't want to give the Ukrainians tanks because people thought that would be escalatory. Although I gather we're going to do that. And of course, Lloyd Austin just said that we're not going to give the Ukrainians ATACMS. Now he said because they don't need them, which is not true. But more generally, it's part of this theory that would somehow be, cause the Russians to escalate. So that's what I mean when I say that. But I said we are negotiating with ourselves because we don't know what the Russian red lines are. We don't know if there are red lines. And frankly, I strongly doubt that Russian red lines actually center around specific weapon systems. If you're worried about the highest probability scenario for Russian nuclear weapons use in Ukraine, it is the full collapse of the Russian military in Ukraine in such a way that it looks like it will be an uncontrolled route to the borders. Now, even in that scenario, I think it's unlikely that Putin will actually respond by using tactical nuclear weapons, but I could imagine in that situation that he might use tactical nuclear weapons to try to freeze the Ukrainian advance and give his military time to recover and stop a general rout. That's much more likely in my judgment than that he would use a nuclear weapon because we give the Ukrainians ATACMS. And my evidence for that is that, on the one hand, all kinds of Putin red lines have been crossed, explicit red lines have been crossed throughout this war. If you want to say, Putin needs to have a justification for using nuclear weapons, he doesn't. His framing of the war before February 24th under Russian doctrine was that this was an existential threat to Russia. That's all he has to say in order for Russia to have the technical justification under its own nuclear doctrine to use nuclear weapons. So that's why I say we're kind of negotiating with ourselves, that the administration is sort of guessing what might trigger something that it's afraid might happen and trying to stay short of that. But I don't think it's guessing is right. And I think that the net effect is that we're constraining our supplies more than we should.
Thank you. Eric, you want to chime in on that? Otherwise, I will give Tom Palmer the last question.
No, the only thing which I put in the chat was, I completely agree with Fred. The most compelling use case for a low yield nuclear weapon would be to try and block the Ukrainians from crossing the isthmus. But even that would be enormously problematic because the Russian forces on the peninsula would have to be prepared to operate in a nuclear environment, which they're not, and the prevailing winds would be blowing the radioactivity both into southern Russia and into Crimea. So, I think the odds, as Fred says, are quite low.
Thank you. Tom Palmer, I muted you again, so I should have muted myself. The cold.
Mr. Kagan, I know you didn't come to talk about energy, but if we had an administration in this country that were committed to providing as much natural gas as we could in a rapid response way, building LNG tankers and things like that. Do you know, I mean, could you address whether we could make a significant difference and stiffen the spine of the Europeans by helping them out this winter? Is it too late for that?
I'm going to offer you the very limited observations of someone who is not an energy expert and try not to get ahead of my skis. My understanding is that the Europeans actually have, with our help in part, amassed sufficient stockpiles to get them, and reserves to get themselves through this winter with the various other provisions that they're engaged in. I think everything that I'm hearing from people who are talking about this is that they can make it through this winter without Russian energy. I'm hearing more concern expressed about what will be left for next winter if they go through this winter without any Russian energy and don't make other changes. But my understanding is, I mean, there was an article, I think, in the Journal about this the other day, that there are tankers full of natural gas that are not unloading because the reserves are still full in Europe and the prices are low, partly artificially low because the Europeans have imposed price caps on them and various other things. So my understanding is the Europeans can likely make it through this winter. My larger concern, and I think this is probably a good point to end on, unless there are more questions. My larger concern is really this. I think a lot of people still imagine that this war ends and then we can in some way go back to normal. And normal involves lifting the sanctions on Russia and getting back into the Russian energy game and, going back to kind of the way that things were. And, ideally in this sort of unicorn fairy tale, Ukraine gets all of its territory back. Putin somehow accepts that. And then we all just decide that this was a bad dream and things go back to the way we were. The one thing I'm confident of is that is not going to be true. We have crossed a watershed moment in world history. Russia has moved into, Putin's Russia has been an explicit enemy of the United States for a very long time, in the sense that he says that we are his enemy. And he has said that across multiple administrations that have promised to do resets with him. He's shown it. It's clear. Putinist Russia, and I use that term advisedly because Putinism will survive Putin absent a fundamental revolution in Russia. Putinist Russia is our active enemy. It will be a trick to keep this war cold. We shouldn't assume that this is going to land permanently in a Cold War environment. It's not cold now. This is a lot of fighting right now. And over time, Russia will rebuild its military and may well again challenge NATO and may challenge NATO more directly. We can't have Europe go back to the kind of energy dependence on Russia that it had before this war. That is a catastrophe for Europe and is a catastrophe for us. So what I'm concerned about is that a lot of the discussions about off-ramps and things are predicated on the notion that somehow this whole thing ends and then we go back to the status quo, which is completely unacceptable. So we've got to wrap our heads around the fact that we're in a new world. Things have changed dramatically, and we've got to be prepared for a fundamentally different economic structure in Europe, a fundamentally different relationship with Russia. And we all have to build in, I would put it this way, we have to build the exclusion of Russia from the international economy into this system in a way that was similar to how we built the exclusion of the Soviet Union from the global economy into the Cold War economic system. That's not the way that it was, but that's the path that Putin has chosen. And I'm afraid that, at least for the foreseeable future, we need to help him down that path.
Thank you very much, Fred. This has been an excellent discussion. You've attracted a company of experts, and we're very grateful to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I really, really, really appreciate it.